Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder. Today I'm joined again by Eric Helms. Big honor to have him back. And as you guys have known, we've kind of been running this little sub podcast on my Swole Radio podcast, the Eric Helms and Dr. Swole show. But it's been great having this continuity where we've been covering a lot of fundamental training concepts. And today we're going to be switching over a little bit more into the diet and nutrition realm. So thanks again for being on the show, Eric.
No, absolutely. It's been an honor to kind of go through the A to Z of training. And I think all of your listeners have hopefully, if they've tracked that sub podcast, like you said, gotten their ducks in a row in the right order, like big duck, medium duck, small duck, all the right ducks in the right places. So yeah, it'd be cool to start touching on the kitchen side of things for sure.
Sweet. So yeah, today we're going to be starting off by talking about the major blocks of nutrition, which are going to be calorie intake. And we'll also be touching on body recomposition, which is a pretty hot topic, especially in YouTube fitness. So yeah, in terms of starting off, Eric, I think a key decision a bodybuilder needs to make is, the quintessential question of bulk or cut. So how should people make that decision?
Yeah, I think it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, what are your goals? Where are you currently? And then to some degree, what is your current relationship with food, which we can touch on a side point as well. Because there's a lot of people who come into their lifting career as someone who is potentially trying to lose 50 pounds. They enjoy the lifting process. They want to change their physique. There's also people who, like say myself, were quite skinny when they started lifting. And then there's people everywhere in between. And I think the people who maybe struggle the most are those who are in the in-betweens. That's why the question is, should I cut or bulk? Because in those two examples, it seems quite obvious, right? Mm-hmm. But I think, there's a good chunk of the population who, if you ask them like, hey, what would your ideal physique look like? The place they want to get to involves both fat loss and muscle gain. So when that is the case, obviously the question of should I be, bulking or cutting first is a more challenging one. Mm-hmm. So I think probably the answer to that question, it depends on dispelling a few myths, and knowing, do I have to do anything, or am I shooting myself in the foot if I make the quote unquote wrong decision, which we can talk about. Mm-hmm. But to some degree, it comes down to personal preference, I think, especially when it comes to the decision to bulk or not. Because I think many people believe that if you are too high in body fat, bulking will do more harm than good, which is probably not true. And then the other way to look at it is, well, okay, is there a point where I really should cut, where that would benefit me the most? And I think that actually is more of a psychological question. Because if you do put yourself in the surplus and you're already not liking your current level of body fat, and you put on muscle and you put on body fat, is that going to sustain your motivation? Is that something that you're going to like the way that looks? And there's deeper questions as to what should you be motivated by and how do you see yourself, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So it's actually one of those very complex questions, but a simple way to look at it is that if you're really new to the game, and you're not like very high in body fat to where that is something that you want to focus on, there's probably no harm in putting yourself in a modest calorie surplus and putting on muscle, because you're going to put on a lot. And you always have the opportunity to cut down the line. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the closest thing to a default, but it's actually quite individualized and nuanced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point where a lot of people kind of jump on the comments and say like, hey man, I'm like 5'9", I weigh this many pounds, what should I do? And it's like there's a lot of things that come into play. Are there sort of general ballpark body fat percentage ranges where you think the answer is pretty clear?
So I think you can put them out there, but it is almost not really super needed until someone says, look, I have the goal to be a competitor. Because if they don't have a goal to be the competitor, what you're basically doing is typically the way this goes is, hey, if you're over 15% body fat or 20% body fat, those are typical ones you hear as a male, mm-hmm. or add, 8 to that. If you're, over if you're outside of the range of like low 20s to high 20% body fat for women, then you should cut first before you bulk. But if we understand the data on what happens when you're high in body fat and you try to put on muscle mass, versus kind of what people often say, we start to see, well, there's no physiological reason that there's anything wrong with trying to put on muscle mass at a high body fat level. So you're basically making an assumption about what the person will like, or how they feel about their body. So I often, instead of saying, it's like, for example, if we say, hey, if you bulk when you're 20% body fat as a male, yeah, you're going to put on some muscle, but you're not going to like the way you look, because you're also getting to this body fat percentage range where you can't see your physique. You can't see the muscle mass gains. And that could be true, but now we are assuming something about the person's motivation. Like, what if they're actually a power lifter and they're trying to put on muscle mass? And like, hey, if they hit a squat PR, they don't really care, or maybe they're just, really have a balanced mindset and they're thinking about the long term. And they're like, I really don't care. If I want to optimize my opportunity now as a novice to put on muscle. And if I don't look great, like, who cares, So honestly, I think that the question should come down to, well, ask yourself, if you were to put on a little bit of body fat and a fair amount of muscle as a novice right now, on top of where you're already at, how would you feel? And that should guide your decision. Instead of me saying, well, I think that you probably won't like what you see at this body fat percentage or higher. And the reason why is not only am I assuming someone's potential, body image, I'm also asking them to estimate their body fat percentage, which we know is a huge landmine. Like the number of times I've seen someone who's 25% body fat say they're 15% body fat, or the number of times I've seen someone who say there's 20% body fat, say they're 15% body fat. It's always 15%. Like, you won't ever admit as a guy that you're over 15%, as long as you can see something that is like a hint of an ab, right? But ultimately, we don't care about body fat percentages. We care about how we look, and we associate how we look with just kind of these internet meme ideas of what a body fat percentage is. So I think that's something to consider. So that is, and you probably have something to say about that. So I'll pause there because I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, where I think a lot of people, they like to default to just the numbers, right? Where they're saying like, well, okay, when I hit a certain X number percentage, it has to be a default reaction that, okay, it's time to cut. Otherwise, I'm, sacrificing the P ratio or whatever for the gains. And I think that it also depends, as you said, a lot on people's goals, where if someone is, more strength oriented, especially someone a bit early on in their career who may not be competing anytime soon, you don't necessarily need to be shredded. And I think there's a lot of pressure that society puts on, the Instagram fitness culture, where you see a lot of people maintaining these crazy shredded physiques year round, and sometimes that isn't really sustainable. I think
I'd say most of the time it's not sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that brings up another question that I've had, is that, like, let's say someone's trying to look at this from the optimal long-term perspective, like career ultimate, optimal hypertrophy. I eventually want to be a competitive bodybuilder, but I'm kind of early on in my journey, and they're kind of maybe in this skinny fat phase where they're just like, oh, should I just keep bulking for a while and bulk in order to capture my beginner gains?
Yes, I think that is that's a relatively easy one to answer, in my opinion, because one thing that does potentially throw a wrench in this is when you're dealing with someone who does want to compete anytime in the mid to near future, because then it just becomes a logistical challenge. Okay, let's say your ideal physique would be a little bit lower in body fat, and let's say you're not influenced by social media, because a lot of the times that the issue there is not that you're higher than your goal. It's that your goal is unsustainable. Like, like your goal would have you walking around with, a quarter of your testosterone levels, and it's only 5 pounds over stage weight. And you just have this warped view from social media. But let's say you don't have that warped view, and you just are, like you said, quote unquote, skinny fat, which, not a huge fan of the term, but we all know what that means. So we'll go with it. Right. Let's say that's you. You're a little higher in body fat than you would like to be. You probably could walk around a little leaner, but you also want to put on a lot of muscle. You're not competing in the near future, but you maybe are competing in the mid to long-term future. Now that's less of an issue, in my opinion, with going into a bulk and maybe driving your body fat up to a point that would be logistically challenging if you needed to do a contest prep. Because if you, let's say you want to compete even in 2 years, right? And let's say you're an early stage intermediate, so you still got some good productive bulks left in you that aren't just gonna, put a bunch of body fat on you. Man, let's say you spend most of a year, bulking, and now you're, say, 40 pounds over stage weight, which doesn't really look that bad on a decently muscular, more or less tall male. The equivalent of that would probably be like 25 pounds over for, a woman who's, reasonably muscular in that same place. That's not bad. Like, no one's going to call you out on the street and be like, what, you're a bodybuilder? Like you're going to look good in clothes. You may be a little softer than you like, and you certainly wouldn't look good, or wouldn't look appropriate, I should say, on a bodybuilding stage, in your trunks or your posing suit. And the issue there is that you worked so hard for this year to start putting on, muscle mass, and now you're 25 pounds over as a woman, or 40 pounds over as a taller guy, or 30 pounds to 35 as like a middle or lightweight guy, and you've got a diet ahead of you. Now you're looking at least at like a 7-month diet to try to, take that off while trying to preserve as much muscle mass as you can. And even if you do a great job, just the length of that diet is eating into the time that you could potentially be putting on muscle mass, right? It's not a great position to be in when you're close to a competition. But if you've got, another 3 years before you're actually going to get on stage, you get 3 or 4 mini cuts that only last, say, 4 to 8 weeks that you intersperse with those, big 9-month blocks of putting on muscle mass. And each one of those can clean you up by, like 8 pounds of fat. And now you're looking at being 2/3 of that same size over stage weight, but with all the muscle mass. So I kind of am working backwards from what my advice is. But let's say, yeah, you're that skinny fat person. The next show is not coming at least for 3 years. Nothing wrong with doing an extended bulk and getting to probably a higher than recommended body fat range than most people would say. We're talking getting into the 30s, like legitimate 30% body fat range for women, or into the mid 20s for a guy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because you have the time to make some adjustments down the line. And with that said, it's not because you should be worried about missing out on your noob gains. So that's an important caveat. It's just that, if you're not in the mood to diet, or you don't feel like it, or you'd prefer to just, focus on gaining, if you're motivated to do that, I'll be honest, like, there's a reason why most fat loss attempts don't succeed long-term with people just maintaining their fat loss. It's because it's really not that fun. It's like, you do see yourself getting leaner, and it can be motivating, but like, especially for someone who is like eager to put on muscle mass at the same time, you're making the process of progressive overload a little harder. You're making the environment a little less ideal for all that. You're potentially, if you're losing a fair amount of weight in that process, like, you're not really going to like what you look like on the other side either. Like, you're getting leaner, but again, you're skinny, right? So you're going to feel like you're getting smaller, and you're probably going to be having more hard-earned gains in strength during that phase. So I think, if you can focus a little more on progressive overload, the fact that you're putting on muscle mass, that you're investing in the future, and not making kind of what I would say is a more short-term decision at this stage, that's not really going to pay off. Like, it's very rare that you see someone who's skinny fat who does a cut and then they go, I look great. Most of the time they're like, oh man, I have way less muscle than I thought, So I think it probably makes sense in this case for you to go for a gaining phase, and just accept the fact that, like, I'm going to, exert some delayed gratification. If my goal is to actually get on stage in the long run, the thing that's going to take the most time and that will need most of my attention is putting on muscle, because I can lose body fat relatively quickly. You can lose 8 pounds of fat in a 6-week mini cut with very little losses in lean mass when you're high in body fat. But to put on 8 pounds of lean tissue, even as a late stage novice, early stage intermediate, might take you a year and a half. So where should your focus be,
Yeah, no, great point. And I think another thing that comes into play when you're talking about beginners is that just their efficiency at fat loss, where I think that, for a beginner, often you'll see people trying to lose fat and they're just kind of spinning their wheels, where they'll be running these little bulk and cut phases, but not really getting anywhere. And I can see how some people might, be better served just really focusing on that progressive overload and building. I think you just touched on that, where the question of, if someone runs their initial newbie phase inefficiently, like let's say they're in a calorie deficit, or maybe they just have something off with their training, do they lose out on total gains down the line?
No, and that's I'm really glad you touched back on that, because I kind of planted the seed and I forgot that I did. I'm a terrible gardener.
Those gains.
Yeah, so like when you think about it, like why do we have a newbie phase, right? And it's because we haven't made those adaptations. Mm-hmm. So we have a low barrier to entry to make these initial adaptations. And you get newbie gains in VO2 max if you start running. Mm-hmm. You get newbie gains in free throw shooting if you start playing basketball. You get newbie gains in, being able to kick better if you're doing martial arts and not look like you're going to fall over. And you get newbie gains in muscle mass and, doing a squat and a deadlift and a bench with better technique, and all of a sudden, being like sometimes literally almost twice as strong within the first 3 months. And so the only newbie gains that you're going to potentially miss out on, but you're going to get them anyway, would be some of those technical execution things. So let's say you're lifting on like a crash diet, which is not uncommon for people first getting into it. They start eating clean. They don't really know what they're doing. They want to get shredded and big at the same time. They don't follow great influences. And they're just basically on like, egg whites and rice and chicken. And all of a sudden they actually are dieting. They are getting leaner, but they've really shortchanged how much muscle mass they can put on, because just that really low energy availability. But let's say they get exposed to some good lifting videos, or maybe they even get a personal trainer who doesn't touch their diet, but helps them learn how to lift. They are going to make some rapid gains in strength. They're going to look like they know what they're doing to a certain degree when they do those movements. So they won't get those gains really quick. However, once they actually do put themselves in a position where they can put on muscle mass and their body is physiologically ready to do that, they're going to see the same noob gains that they might have had before, because their body still hasn't made them. So that's really the only determination of whether you'll have noob gains is, have you had noob gains yet? If you have, then you can't have them again. But if you haven't, then you haven't, And I could think of an outside case where, someone who is, in their late 50s starts doing this, and they manage to spin their wheels for 10 years. At 65, you might not be able to make the same kind of noob gains you would if you'd started training even 10 or 15 years ago. But I have seen, middle-aged men and women who start training and they make noob gains, So I think the effects of age are often over-exaggerated, and it is definitely not a win. And I also think the effects of being a teenager are over-exaggerated. Like, people describe that as a natural steroid cycle. But realistically, like, some of the steroid cycles that are out there are still like 10 times the amount of testosterone that even a teenage male is going to have. So I think really it does come down to, if you haven't had your newbie gains, they're still right for the taking. So, which is great news for everybody, I think.
Yeah, and swinging back around kind of to the broad overview lens, where, let's say someone is looking at this of, I want the best overall, like, competitive outlook in terms of like my whole career. Like, I'm not worried about 5-10 years down the line. You hear people talking about how people should spend their 20s bulking, and then their 30s getting shredded, and kind of that older bodybuilder grainy look kind of paradigm floating around. What are your thoughts on kind of the overall planning for a strategy for a bodybuilder?
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to with just trying to be efficient, and efficiency comes down to, for a bodybuilder, thinking about the fact that there are mandatory, aggressive, brutal cuts that you're going to do to get on stage. And even if you're someone like me who competes very sporadically, like at the most frequent every 2 years, like I competed in 2011, and then I had a huge break because I was doing my doctoral and master's degree, and didn't compete again until 2019. But now I'm done with school. Like, I don't have things that are like that, and I'm waiting until 2023 to get back on stage. So it's a 4-year delay between competition years. What am I doing? Why? Well, it's just because it takes time to put on muscle mass now, since I've been lifting since 2004. I've got a whole 17-year-old inside of me of lifting, right? So some people would not be motivated by that as competitors, and they might compete more frequently, and that's fine. Don't get me wrong. But for me, I like to give myself a fighting chance at improvement. So what I'm doing is I'm matching my time course of my quote unquote gaining phase, big picture, not talking about like 8 weeks, but we're talking about like from a competitor's like multi-year periodization kind of perspective with nutrition. I'm thinking about, well, realistically, how much time do I need to focus on mostly bodybuilding, being in a surplus most of the time, and trying to make some substantive, noticeable physique changes? I think it's going to take me, more than a couple years. Okay, cool. So that's going to dictate when I compete again. And that maximal estimated rate of muscle gain should therefore, to some degree, be matched by how quickly you're trying to put on muscle mass when you get down to a smaller and smaller unit of time. So I'm not going to be trying to put on a pound a week like I might have back when I was a novice or my first 6 months of training. So I think that's what it comes down to, is you need to be efficient. You need to match the expected rate of weight gain to some degree, and you'll have to tweak this over time with yourself. I mean, I went through 2 to 3 attempts at bulking that were just too overzealous, just not enough good information at the time. And when I was in my first 3 or 4 to 5 years of lifting from, drug-free competitors and things like that. So I didn't know where to look, too influenced by magazines, the equivalent of, the social media today, really. Bad social media. So, you're going to tweak this and figure out, how much really, what rate of weight gain can I put on to where I'm not just putting on a huge proportion of fat compared to the ratio of muscle mass. And you're going to find that changes over time. And eventually you just need to be in a very slight surplus, because being in a bigger surplus doesn't get you anything more noticeable in terms of muscle gain, or what you do get is vastly outpaced by most of that additional energy getting stored as body fat. So there are a couple of ways to approach that, either just slow gaining, what some people call gaintaining, or the various other terms that mean the same thing that are out there now. Or other people will take a slightly more aggressive approach, which I think is fine, and then just do more frequent mini cuts to kind of clean up. And I don't think there's necessarily, within a reasonable range, I don't think one is more efficient than the other. And what do I think is a reasonable range? And here's a number that I've pulled out of my butt for years that's purely based on anecdote, is that you have at least like a 4-to-1 ratio of time spent in a bulk to time spent in a cut. So that would mean that if you were putting on muscle mass or the attempt of being in a surplus for 4 months, you could have at the most frequent a 1 month mini cut after that. And I would probably, and I think, in anything more than that, like if you go 3 months to 1 month, you might be shortchanging yourself. Like you're probably gaining too aggressively to where the efficiency is lower and your body fat is coming on too quickly to then have to, if you have to take it off, like every quarter, you're going, I got to cut again. Like you're gaining pretty fast for someone who is, past their newbie phase. So I think that's a decent way to think of it. You could spend in a year, 11 months of it in a very mild surplus, and then do a little bit of a cut at some point. Or you could have every, like I said, every 5th month after 4 months of being in a surplus, you could do a more aggressive mini cut. And those would probably be negligibly different if I had to guess in terms of what the actual outcome would be. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. But if you go if you go beyond that in either direction, I think you can run into problems. Like if you are always trying to just recomp, essentially, and just gaining, or you're in a slight surplus most of the time, but not always. And sometimes you're in a slight deficit or out around maintenance. And for 2 years, 3 years, you're probably gaining a little less muscle than you could have expected with providing a little more nutritional support. And likewise, if you are, every 5th week, I have to do a mini cut for a week just to kind of combat the fact that I was basically on the seafood diet. That's SEE food diet. Then you're each time you do that, like that's such a high ratio of cuts to bulks that you have less time to actually be putting on muscle mass. So yeah, there's probably a bell curve distribution of what's reasonable. And, I'm not going to sit here and debate somebody if they're in that same kind of region as me, because I don't think we have any good evidence to suggest anecdotally otherwise that one is better than the other.
Yeah, no, those are great insights. And I think that, I call it the bulk to cut ratio. And I actually think that's a key, a central point in thinking about bodybuilding periodization. And, I'd love to go down this rabbit hole and writing a book on bodybuilding periodization. But I think that a lot of it is dictated by your level of experience, and how quickly you're able to put on muscle and how effectively you can cut. So I think someone who's more of a beginner, I think that, yeah, something like that 4-to-1 ratio is going to be a great ballpark. I put out the same recommendation where you're probably able to gain at a fairly like robust rate where you want to be gaining at a rate where you can kind of capture all of your muscle gains and not too much more than that. Like you don't want to be, the ideal bulk is one where you capture all the muscle, but not necessarily put on excess fat, because you'll have to waste time cutting it off later. And then, yeah, and then a beginner probably isn't going to be wanting to jump into really aggressive mini cuts, or might not be as efficient in that sense. But as you become more experienced, you're going to be putting on less muscle at any given unit of time. So you just don't want to be gaining as rapid a rate. And then you'll be able to cut more effectively, where you can very confidently strip off fat quickly while maintaining muscle. And yeah, for example, yeah, like for myself, then I think my last cycle I spent 8 months bulking, and then cut off in about a 3-week mini cut. So at that point I'm kind of getting to like a 10-to-1 bulk to cut ratio. But yeah, it's very individual. And yeah, that kind of segues into the next topic, which is body recomposition. And I think that this is something that a lot of people ask about, especially on YouTube, and people talk about maingaining or gaintaining, kind of that concept of, I'm going to keep my calories near to maintenance, or maybe just like a tiny little rate of gain where I'm only putting on muscle. But yeah, in terms of body recomp, it's basically the process of building muscle and losing fat at the same time. And I think for a long time, bodybuilders said that it was impossible, and you gotta be in a surplus. I think at this point, we can probably say that it does happen. But what are your thoughts on the sort of viability of a body recomposition approach?
Yeah, I think it's important to clarify, like, where did the conversation around this come from? And having been around enough and having read a lot of historical accounts and talked to some of the quote unquote older timers, obviously I didn't talk to anyone from like the 50s because they're not alive anymore, unfortunately. But this largely came as like an oversimplification from the evidence-based community, in my opinion. I think this is one of the times, this community has dropped the ball. And it's not the only one. And I say that as someone who's part of the community. So when you're dealing with, let's say we're talking about the 80s and 90s, a community in the bodybuilding community that is largely focused on which foods you eat and more subjective determinants of energy intake. Like, hey, you got to feel like you're eating every couple hours, you're eating large portions, you should feel full. Like it's hard. You got to force yourself to get into a surplus, which is, partially fueled by the fact that when you're enhanced, you can gain weight at a larger rate. And by the fact that when you're eating super, clean foods, quote unquote, that you will be more full than you otherwise would have been. The conversation back then, people weren't focused on calorie intake, or whether you're in a surplus or a deficit very often. I think they understood those like general concepts, but no one was prescribing specific calorie surpluses or deficits as a percentage or as a number of calories. And back then there was no one debating the idea that you couldn't, put on muscle while also losing fat in certain instances. There was no one who's saying that's not possible. What that came from was from when the pushback against this kind of qualitative and subjective look at food, like the typical diet for a bodybuilding show in the early 2000s, late 90s, was basically, you break a period up into 12 weeks. And every like 3 or 4 week period, the diet gets more restrictive in terms of the foods that you're allowed to have. And essentially you're just cutting carbs and fat throughout. And eventually you end up on just veggies and protein, right? And that's the way that you get shredded, which induces a ever increasing calorie deficit. So once people started going, look, if you want a diet, it's not about these specific foods. You need to be in a deficit. If you want to be in a deficit, you have to count calories and you have to understand, thermodynamics and energy balance. Listen, to lose fat, you got to be in a deficit. To gain weight, you got to be in a surplus. That statement I made is very helpful if you get confused by these subjective qualitative determinants. But a lot of what I just said there was false, right? So you don't have to be in a calorie surplus to gain weight, right? And even if we looked at it, because we understand that there are the energetic value of a pound of lean tissue and a pound of fat are vastly different. We know this from counting macros, right? Like there's 4 calories per gram, which is a unit of weight, a unit of mass of protein, but there's 9 calories per gram for a unit of fat, right? So if we were to remove one of those grams, there are different energetic amounts. So if you were to have an equal weight of fat gain and protein gain, and I'm specifically saying protein here, not lean body mass, because it's not 100% protein, it's going to get very complex, you will be in a deficit despite your weight staying the same, right? Because there's a 4 calorie, investment and a 9 calorie loss. Okay. Now this gets even more complex when we realize that maybe 80 to 90% of adipose tissue is composed of fat, but it's got some other stuff in there like water and some protein structures. And when a pound of lean body mass is actually, the majority of it is not actually protein. So that's confusing, right? And we are not in a light switch on or off state of a deficit or a surplus. We are going, like, every time you eat, even in a small calorie deficit overall, you're in an acute surplus. And then between meals, you get to be in a net deficit, and especially after you sleep, right? It's like a bank account. If you just got paid, but then you spend money, it's going to fluctuate up or down. You need to have a financial advisor, or at least to look at your account more effectively to see, well, am I currently losing or saving money, right? So that is the same way our bodies operate. And we can eventually get into a physiological state where it's unreasonable to expect us to be able to put on any lean mass while we're also losing body fat. We're like, let's say that the calorie intake itself is just so low, like that example I gave earlier, that, your body is immediately going, okay, this isn't good. Here are some symptoms of low energy availability, and you're going to start to get reds, and there's going to be a very limited amount of muscle mass you can put on. Or maybe you're just in a very slight deficit, and that's fine. But eventually that slight deficit over time is pushing your body fat down. You're starting to have some, metabolic adaptations. And eventually you get to a point where you're too lean to expect any further recomps, and you're going to plateau, right? And also you've also kind of used up your quote unquote noob gains, which are going to happen despite, some of the challenges physiologically, because they're just so low of a threshold. And that's part of the adaptive nature of being, any creature that's trying to survive, right? You need to be able to make some adaptations in the face of a poor environment, or we wouldn't be here today. If you think about survival of the fittest, way back in the day when there was not GNCs on every corner, but rather there were, wolves trying to eat us, and we did not have an industrialized society, let alone an agricultural society. Yeah, like you're going to need to be able to adapt. So anyway, the idea that you have to be in a surplus to gain weight, you must be in a deficit to lose weight, is an oversimplification once we start understanding all of those things. So the reality is that when you look at all of the resistance training studies out there, and I'm talking thousands of studies, where they, since the 80s, right, where they measure body composition, they have people start resistance training, and they don't give them guidance on nutrition. They're just focused on the training, and like, whatever you do with your nutrition is fine. Most of the time, what you see is an increase in muscle mass and either a slight drop in body fat or roughly no change in body fat on average, with some distribution across the participants. So you could argue that the non-modified state of a novice who is starting in a reasonable kind of body fat percentage range, their natural response to training is recomposition. That's how common it is. Because what we do when we're in a energy regulated state is when we increase, which means not being super sedentary, not necessarily being in a super modern food environment, is that when we increase our energy expenditure by, let's say, participating in a study where I'm now lifting weights 3 days a week, we increase our energy intake, but we don't purposely try to bulk unless the participants told us to, right? So we get into this more matched, still roughly on average around maintenance, and we start gaining all this muscle for our noob gains. And because we're still roughly around maintenance, we might see maybe increases in the water weight, total weight, maybe not, or we might see even a slight loss in weight because of the energetic value of tissues, but we're going to gain muscle, and we're either going to maintain or slightly lose body fat. Typically, that's what happens, when you get this initial big increase in hunger, when you just start lifting weights for the first time. So recomposition is a very normal, natural thing, and it's been observed literally thousands of times. The idea that it is impossible, because you have to be in a deficit to cut and a surplus to bulk, and therefore you can't do the two things at the same time. While it came from the quote unquote evidence-based community, it's actually an oversimplification of energy balance, and then something that has been repeated by other people listening to those evidence-based practitioners and making an extrapolation. So it's a game of broken telephone is really what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Now, just because it is so obvious and apparent in these novice lifters, that doesn't necessarily mean that translates towards, oh, we should just recomp for the people who maybe listen to this podcast who are probably past their newbie phase. And there's a couple reasons why. So for one, when we are talking about recomposition, it's actually a very difficult term to pin down, because two people could mean two different things, right? So if you were to focus on body fat percentage, you will see this differently than body fat mass, which is typically what a researcher using DEXA is going to look at. So let's say, for example, that you went from 180 pounds to 190 pounds and you stayed at 10% body fat. You gained a pound of fat. Whether you realize, like, you might not think about it, like, no, I didn't gain any fat mass because my body fat percentage is still the same. That's kind of how most kind of fitness meme people think of body fat percentage is how you calculate it. But no, 10% of 180 is 18, 10% of 190 is 19. You gained a pound of fat. Right. And you gain 9 pounds of lean tissue, and, maybe 2 pounds of that was actual protein. So it's not an easy thing. But then when you chuck someone in a DEXA, we would say in that case, oh, they put on X amount of lean tissue, they put on X amount of fat mass. And two people would look at that very differently in an anecdotal real world scenario versus reading a study. So is that body recomposition? Body fat percentage stayed the same and I gained muscle, but I also gained weight? No, I think that's just a surplus, right? But some people would call it, body recomposition. Now, you can also get the same scenario where someone's body fat percentage went down. Let's say that you did just put on 10 pounds of muscle. You went from 180 to 190, right? But your fat mass stayed at 18 pounds. So that means your body fat percentage went down slightly. You're now 9 point something. So I can't math that quick off the fly. So now it looks like you've lost body fat and you've gained muscle. But you haven't lost body fat, right? You still have the same amount of fat tissue if we did a DEXA on you. It is just that it's a smaller proportion of now your total mass. So is that body recomp? I would say no, that's just a really effective bulk, right? You just put on muscle. You didn't lose any body fat. So what a recomposition technically is the simultaneous loss of fat mass and gaining of lean tissue. And most of the time in the real world, when people think they have done that, they're actually in one of those two former scenarios. It's a slight gain of fat mass with a large gain in muscle mass. So they look better overall and think they got leaner because their body fat percentage went down, even though they gained fat. Or they just had a really effective lean bulk, which again will have the same visual consequences, but they didn't actually lose any fat mass. And because of the energetic differences in lean tissue and fat tissue, most of the time when people think recomping is happening, they're actually in a slight deficit. Like if your weight stayed roughly the same, but you clearly gained muscle, you were probably actually in a deficit, right? Because the fat tissue has twice the energetic value of the protein, and the lean tissue you're putting on that shows up as scale weight is mostly water, right? So even when we do see scenarios of body weight staying the same, but then just looking better, they're probably in a deficit, and they just were able to put on a little bit of muscle tissue. So true body recomposition should result in typically like slight amount of weight loss, right? Because the muscle tissue component does not have as much energy. And if you were at maintenance and making changes, you'd lose weight. So, but that's all confounded by the fact that when we step on a scale, it's not a DEXA scanner, right? It's measuring changes in everything. And if you're training, muscle damage, edema, you're a little bit heavier, right? So that's one reason. You start taking creatine, right? A little bit more water retention initially. You go on a higher carb diet. I think there's so many things that can confound the scale weight that are not even related to the topic of body recomposition, that it's almost impossible for someone to know whether they are experiencing body recomposition. However, it's entirely possible and quite normal. Now, so what are the things that can affect it? So if someone is a listener to this podcast, they're probably an intermediate or more advanced than that, or at least, a late stage novice. And they've made probably the majority of their noob gains. And let's say they want to give recomp a shot. It is going to be more challenging the leaner you are, which kind of flies in the face of some of the P ratio conversations, that may be a myth we need to bust in this conversation. I don't know. You can tell me. Because like I mentioned earlier, if you're not in a good physiological state to put on muscle, it's not going to happen. And being super lean and walking around lean all the time, for most people, is going to lead them to be in a state where it's harder to put on muscle mass. Mm-hmm. But if you're anywhere higher than that, whether you're actually quite high in body fat or whether you're in a quote unquote normal or middling body fat range, you got a decent chance of being able to put on muscle mass and maybe not have a significant change in fat mass, or maybe even lose a little bit of fat mass, maybe, but typically not. So you would accomplish this by being either in a slight deficit, if you want to recomp with actual fat mass loss, or you just, like you said earlier, you have to have a appropriate increase in calories where you're trying to avoid not only just excess fat mass, but almost any visible changes in fat mass. So at worst, you want proportionate increases in fat mass so that your body fat percentage doesn't go up. Like in that example of going from 180 to 190 with 1 pound of fat mass gain, still having the same body fat percentage with more muscle. So that looks like being basically very cautious, tracking very meticulously, and having a very effective training program. And that will work to the degree that it can for you. So a highly advanced lifter can recomp, but it is going to be a necessarily slower process than what we recommended earlier. So it just takes patience, and you also have to be on your shit. Like, you need to be tracking meticulously. And often it's just not a good combination with a balanced life, because it kind of requires the same level of meticulousness, because like if you go, well, I'm just going to look at the output scale change, and just make sure I'm not gaining any more than like a pound every 2 months or something like that. And I go, like, sure, but how much of that time are you now kind of spending all over the place? Like, what does your lifestyle actually quite homogenous and you're getting that? Okay, you're good. But if not, most people are going to need to be whipping out the calorie tracker in the off season, really making sure that their training is constantly stimulative. Like, there's really there's no points where you get to rest on your laurels, because you can't, if you really just want to have a strict recomposition. So I think recomp often happens quite naturally. And I don't think there's anything wrong with someone who is quote unquote skinny fat as a novice, just lifting and not worrying about it with their nutrition, just trying to focus on eating more high protein foods and eating healthier, and generally seeing the scale trend up without tracking macros. And they will probably experience one of those categories of recomp. So like, that's the way to view it. But I think recomping as a more advanced lifter, it is probably just a little less efficient, but it may be worth it if you're in a maintenance phase and you don't have like a competition on the horizon, like, if you're not a competitor, like what is the rush, right? And to some degree, you're not going to have to go through a 6-month period where you're actually going to lose some muscle mass towards the end and really, beat yourself up to that contest prep process. And then have to be like, all right, for the next 6 months, if you're competing back-to-back years, or 1.5 years, if it's every other year, I'm going to just try to get everything out of my body. Because if you wanted to put on muscle mass at the fastest pace, don't compete in bodybuilding, because then you won't have to starve yourself every season, ironically. So anyway, I think those are just my thoughts on recomposition. The things that make it harder are being more experienced. And it's not that it makes the process impossible. It is just that the rate of weight gain that you can meaningfully add muscle mass with is slow anyway. And now you're going, I don't want to put on any body fat, right? So it just makes that you're eating a smaller portion of a smaller pie. Being really, really lean actually makes it harder to recomposition, despite stories to the contrary. Like, if you look at what happens to bodybuilders immediately after a show, if the P ratio was a strict interpretation was accurate, you're shredded. So you should have the best P ratio. So once you start eating all kinds of things and training hard because you don't feel fatigued anymore, you should just turn into like the Akira monster, because all you're putting on is muscle and you just become this Hulk-like thing. But no, in reality, what happens is you put on almost exclusively body fat and then a bunch of water tissue and glycogen and shit like that. So yeah, it is not until like you get out of that physiological state of just having starved yourself to where your body's going, oh, I can prioritize muscle mass, because I actually just don't want you to die because you're stuck in the Sahara for a month and you're at 4% body fat. We're focusing on survival here is kind of our physiology thinking, because it's not realizing that now we're in a modern world. So the idea of a P ratio is just simply that the leaner you are, the more propensity you will have to put on muscle, which we know is just obviously false when we start looking at anecdotal evidence on bodybuilders and actually observational research on bodybuilders, or they would be putting on muscle mass out of competition. And it also falls apart when you start to look at attempts to put on muscle mass in people who are very high in body fat, which do just fine. We have a ton of resistance training studies on people with obesity, and they are, despite some physiological things that might have a mechanism for impeding muscle gain, theoretically, they're able to put it on just fine. We have evidence looking at football players showing that linemen and wide receivers at very different body fat percentages in the offseason are gaining similar amounts of lean mass. And also we have an in-house meta-analysis that Dr. Trexler and Greg Nuckols did at Stronger by Science, where they just took a bunch of studies where they gave open access data and they just plotted, okay, what is the body fat change and what is the body fat of these individuals and how much muscle mass do they gain? Is there a relationship there? And if anything, the relationship was slightly the other way, that when you're higher in body fat, and overall it was like a null relationship, that there's no relationship between being too high in body fat and impeding your ability to put on lean mass. But in some cases, it actually seemed like, oh, people higher in body fat might be able to put on lean mass more effectively to a very small degree. And that might just be the bottom end of that tail getting dragged down to people who are too lean, rather than there being an advantage to being, like super, super high in body fat. So anyway, I just had a huge rant and ramble all over the place, but hopefully that helps people understand recomposition and prevents them from making the mistake of thinking, oh, I need to periodically diet so I can get lean enough so I can have an effective bulk. That's not true. If you want to periodically diet and do like the mini cuts that we've been talking about, that is a competitor's concern, because we eventually have to get shredded, and all that body fat has to come off. So for everyone else who's a non-competitor, it really just comes down to, what is healthy for me mentally and physically as a body fat to sustain, which is probably higher than you want it to be initially until you kind of get your head around a non-social media influenced view of your body. And then, okay, well, I need to continually cut back to something around there or slightly lower than it, so I just have a runway to get back into my next surplus. Or you can just kind of take that maintaining or gaintaining approach once you're at roughly around your desired body fat. And the idea that you're going to be slightly less optimal in terms of your efficiency might be worth it, because then you don't have to do all this bulking, cutting, calculations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great points. And I think you just busted about 1,000 TikTok videos out there who are misguided on body recomposition. So yeah, no, those are great points. And yeah, I like how you also mentioned about how, yeah, it can work for a wide range of people, and even, beyond necessarily the initial few months. For someone who's, as they get more advanced, you mentioned that, yeah, like you're eventually going to have slower progress with this kind of approach if you just say, like, I really don't want to put on fat. At what kind of point in someone's experience level would you say that it's less optimal, to have a sort of maintaining approach? Like who do you think it's appropriate to be recommending this to?
I will put forth that I see nothing wrong from the holistic perspective with even advanced or intermediate non-competitors doing a gaintaining approach, or just kind of trying to recomp all the time, because you don't need to get shredded and you don't have therefore a limited time frame when to put on muscle. So like, I don't think it is a healthy mentality to be like, well, I've got to get to my natty limit. Like there's a point rather than an asymptote, which it's not the way it works. By the time I'm 28, or I should have quit lifting at all. Like a huge part of enjoying the process of putting on muscle and getting bigger and working towards a physique is the process, right? The process that's probably the most enjoyable part. If it's not for you, I hate to say it, but without a change in mentality, in 5 years, I doubt you're still going to be lifting, because I wouldn't do something for 5 years I didn't enjoy. So I think that does require a mentality shift. And especially if you're someone who hates the cutting process, or just finds it very challenging, or like, why do I have to do this? And the only reason why you have to do it is because you're bulking hard before it. So you create a physique that you don't like, so you have to fix it. And then the question will be, well, why don't you just maybe take a slower approach? So you only have to do this maybe 8 or 9 or 10 months, or you just don't do it at all. And that's fine, so long as you're okay with potentially a slower rate of gain, and maybe sometimes finding a plateau that you can't break unless you actually try to support that, and being willing to do that every now and again. So that's my caveat for the advice that I'm going to give, which I would say pretty much from the intermediate stage onward, it's going to be challenging to optimize the efficiency of muscle gain without having some degree of considering what we talked about earlier, like that bulk to cut ratio. But that can look for an advanced lifter, like, so for myself, for example, I finished my more strength phase at August of 2021. I did, nationals got canceled for powerlifting. But, I competed in my garage, hit some PRs, and I was like, sweet, I'm pretty pleased with this strength focused phase that I've had since, 2020. And now I want to compete in 2023. So I've got like a year and a half. So for the next year, I want to really be focused on bodybuilding, and I want to spend the majority of that time in a surplus. So I was right around 93, and now I'm around like 95, 96. So in the last, say, September, October, November, December, January, February, in the last 6 months, I put on 3 kilos, right? That's about a pound a month. And not all of that is tissue, I'm eating a lot more. So if I was just to kind of go back to not trying to eat in the surplus, I might drop a pound right there. So we're talking about, for someone like me, like gaining a pound a month is what an intermediate would probably consider like a gaintaining approach. But I think a pound a month is very appropriate for someone who is, hoping to have their stage weight go up by a kilogram, 4 years later.
Yeah.
So I think what that looks like is very context dependent based on your experience. So, I mean, the alternative for me, if I was to be like, I'm just going to kind of maintain, is me just to try to stay at 93 and maybe one day look up and be like, I look a little leaner at 93 than I was before. And I'm a little hungrier. Okay, let's see if I can do the same thing at 94 for the next 2 years, And so for me, I'm actually okay with that. But when I decide I want to compete in bodybuilding, then I get after it a little more. And I do notice that I can, if I really focus my training primarily on bodybuilding, and if I put myself into a place where I'm in a surplus on most days, even if a small one, I do get better gains. I do see that my physique starts to change in noticeable, faster trajectory. But it's the kind of thing that you need the eye and the experience of someone who has been at it for 17 years to kind of really see. And I think most novices wouldn't even notice a difference between me, my physique changes from August till now.
Yeah, that's a good point. That all this is very context dependent, and a lot of it depends on your level of experience. Bring it back kind of to the more beginner versus early intermediate person who, let's say, is kind of like a middling body fat range, and they want to recomp a lot of, in terms of the nuts and bolts of how to. A lot of people will say, like set your calories somewhere around maintenance, or as you mentioned before, not think too much about it. But let's say they actually want to get a bit leaner, and like they want to be in a deficit and they want to lose fat, but also build muscle, which is probably going to be very viable if they're relatively beginner. What range of calorie balances do you think it's possible to recomp in?
I think you will probably, if you're like a true novice, so long as you're not dieting in such a way that is pretty damn harsh, you will probably put on a little bit of muscle mass. You're just going to slow down your kind of new gains, if you will. And I think the smaller that deficit, the more likely you'll be able to put on some muscle mass in that process. So like a 10. So like if someone was in that position, I would probably say, try like a 10% deficit, and run that for like 6 months. And at that point, you should be noticeably leaner, and you will have also put on a little bit of muscle mass. And at that point, okay, let's actually do like a proper gaining phase, where at the least aggressive, you would want to see a slight gain in body fat, because that would indicate you're probably gaining at an appropriate rate. But yeah, I think you could probably have a 10, 20, 25% deficit and still be able to put on muscle mass in that scenario that you're talking about, with it scaling down the larger the deficit.
Yeah, no, I think that's really reassuring for people, I think, in realizing that this is especially if you're a beginner, it's a very robust process, like especially once you start getting your training under control and really thinking about things and seeking protein and all those things a lot as possible.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing to consider is that like muscle mass is a slow process. And if you're in a deficit, you're slowing it down a little more. And most people, the timeline that they're in a deficit is short. So the idea that we can't recomp is also sometimes defined by the fact that, people are only dieting for like half a year. So like they tried to put on a little muscle during their cut and they're unsure if it happened. Well, it's like you also just, it's a short period of time, and you can't cut, and you really shouldn't cut indefinitely, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not the right time scale. All like the focus of your goals becomes the time scale that you scale to, and I think that is sometimes a downfall of being on the cut train all the time, is that you can see almost weekly or bi-weekly changes in your physique when you're dropping body fat. So it kind of gets addictive, Mm-hmm. But if you want to really have a physique that you're truly proud of once you diet down, now we're talking about the time scale of decades, So I think there is something to be said for that. I think a lot of people who are kind of really focused on not just recomp, but like simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. So that more hardcore deficit, like that's probably going to be a net deficit. Substantial fat mass while gaining muscle mass. They're probably too focused on the short term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting kind of point about, and you alluded to this earlier about how as bodybuilders, like it's ironic how I think bodybuilding is one of the only sports where competing actually harms you. Yep. like it actually costs time and it costs like a lot of physiological adaptation that is negative towards the goal of building muscle. Like losing the fat and once you break beyond a certain point is detrimental. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting little dynamic that you have to take into consideration.
Absolutely. And because bodybuilders are the most impressive physiques on the planet, I am one of them. So people inherit the tools and techniques of bodybuilders, and often they are not the best tools for non-competitive bodybuilding, and I think this is a big reason why a lot of people sometimes develop unhealthy relationships around their food and their body, because they're learning from people who are have to compete at shredded conditions, Mm-hmm. So yeah.
That's something that it's important for people to kind of take with a grain of salt when they see people on Instagram or social media, or like even watching us, like I'll be in prep, I post an Instagram story of me at the grocery store buying a bunch of diet soda, pickles, sauerkraut, just like it's like a big box of Splenda. It's just like, well, I mean, if you're a more recreational lifter, some of these things might not be necessary.
No, I mean, you have strategies in place to make a intentionally temporary period of time more survivable. But the average person who is out there trying to cut and might be learning from you, is hopefully listening to this, they understand the difference, is actually trying to cut to a point that they then plan to sustain long term. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And what do bodybuilders do after their show? They go eat a large pizza, right? Like they are not trying to sustain it. They want to get back to a point where they can then therefore put on muscle mass again, and muscle mass they just lost from the intensive dieting phase. So it's like an intentional yo-yo diet, which we know is not something you should intend in the real world of non-competitive bodybuilding, where it's like, you might go through bulk and cut phases, but you're going to cut to something that you think you can sustain, or that is, something that's not actually going to, like you said, harm you or harm your long-term goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I have a good friend who's a dietitian, and she's always kind of shaking her head when I'm going through the extreme prep phase. So yeah, anyways, that's been a great talk on, I think, broad overview, some interesting strategy for the bodybuilders out there, and good tips for people thinking about recomp. Just to finish up on a fun question, taking one from the Facebook group. Someone asked about range of motion training. So total pivot of topic, but sure. This has been something that's been talked about pretty frequently in recent times in the science building sphere. Kind of the idea of full range of motion versus the most effective range of motion, where people talk about like different ranges of motion for hypertrophy. what are your thoughts on the role of different range of motion and I suppose partials?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think what is becoming clearer and clearer as more data and especially more applied studies come out is that not all partials are created equal. And one of, if not the main driving factor for why full range of motion training most of the time seems to produce more hypertrophy when it's appropriately matched to a partial range of motion condition is that the full range of motion contains the portion of that range where the muscle, and therefore the sarcomere, potentially, depending on the anatomy of the muscle and the exercise, is at a stretched position, which seems to be a signaler for anabolism and hypertrophy. So it is training a muscle at a longer muscle length that trains sarcomeres at a longer length that is inducing an additional hypertrophic stimulus that is potentially the main juice, if you will, no pun intended, behind full range of motion training, rather than just kind of some esoteric idea of, full range of motion is better because science said so, right? That said, I think it's important to remember that like isometric training that does produce muscle growth. And yes, training at shorter muscle lengths is probably not as good as training at longer muscle lengths, but it is not a binary thing. So these are relatively small differences. You wouldn't want to complete like all of your training at short muscle lengths. And you wouldn't want to try to train only at long muscle lengths or try to make sure every single exercise was carried out to the longest muscle length possible at the sacrifice of form or potentially at the cost of inducing pain or et cetera. But I think it's mostly just an interesting tidbit of how we understand why full range of motion training is driving better growth in studies. So I think there's nothing wrong with experimenting with some partials where you're using the longer muscle length position. So an example of that would be doing flies or cable crossovers and only coming up to say, maybe when viewed from like your head on, your hands are maybe coming up in kind of like a V position, but not all the way up to where your hands touch one another. Or doing the bottom range of a leg extension that's actually been researched, or the bottom, third or half of a bicep curl. Maybe if you're just focusing on that range and that's where you go to failure, you're spending more of your total time at a long muscle length. Maybe that'd even be better than full range of motion training. We don't know that yet. The research we have just suggests that, doing that leg extension at the bottom or doing that bicep curl at the bottom compared to doing that bicep curl at just the top or that leg extension at just the top produces significantly more hypertrophy. So I think it's interesting, but I think also it's not like all of a sudden this changes everything.
Yeah.
We should never train at anything except long muscle lengths. And there are other interactions. So like you might find that the highest point of required force production of a movement is at a short muscle length. Is that important? Is it worthwhile to select certain exercises that bias a shortened position? Would that help at all? And that's a hard question to answer. Like we do know that training at longer muscle length seems to produce not only just greater hypertrophy, but that it is primarily driven by hypertrophy in the distal region of that muscle. Right? So distal and proximal just means further from the joint or closer to the joint. While if you compare that long muscle length partial to a shortened muscle length partial, the shortened muscle length seems to produce more proximal hypertrophy. However, and so some people may go, well, therefore I should use exercises that train and bias a short muscle length and a long muscle length. And I go, maybe, but we don't actually have a good comparison here because a full range of motion training protocol includes both the long muscle length and the short muscle length. So does it even matter? And I think that's a piece that I've heard like not fully thought through, in my opinion. People are going, hey, long muscle lengths are great, but they produce differential regional hypertrophy. So we should be including short muscle length, even though it's worse, but we want that proximal hypertrophy. And I'm going, just doing a full bicep curl gets both the fully extended and shortened position, right? Like maybe we don't have to choose, So what I would love to see in future studies would be, say, 3 groups: a group training at long muscle lengths, a group training at short muscle lengths, and then a group training at full range of motion. and looking at not only at total hypertrophy, but also regional hypertrophy, and seeing, does it all come out in the wash or what? So I think that is really where we need to go for the future to have better understandings of this question.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, it's just cool to see these kind of hot topics coming out, and especially when you still want to see more research to really understand. That's where it gets interesting. I have a few thoughts on this as well. I think that a lot of people kind of get caught up in the partials where they're just like, yeah, I'm going to compare, but the problem is when you compare, say, like a set of 8 on, your lengthened bicep curl, just the lower part of it, versus a set of 8 on the full range. I mean, the thing is, the full range of motion also contains that stretched position, but you're sacrificing volume, is the way I see it. Is like, you're actually, if you're reducing the range of motion, I mean, you can look at volume in terms of sets times reps times weight, but also times distance lifted. Like, if you think about volume kind of from a total work perspective. So I think that if you just like traded sets, you would actually be sacrificing some degree of volume in terms of trading, full range.
So I'm gonna challenge you on that, because I think so. Let's take a look at the volume that you might use, right? So if you are only doing the longer muscle length partial with the same load that you might be doing the full range of motion, you would be able to do more reps, though. So it's going to end, because volume is sets times reps times load. So the amount of, and also, like, does all volume count towards arc growth?
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a good caveat. So if you can get around that by equating, RIRs, and
exactly. So if you did, I think that if you compared a full range of motion training protocol on a bicep curl, and you equated with RIR, and you choose whatever load you need to fail in, let's say, the 8 to 12 rep range, right? And you have the other group only do the bottom half of that curl, but they go to the same RIR. I don't think you'd see much of a difference in muscle growth. And you might even get a little more out of the long muscle length position, because all of the effort they're putting forth and all of the fatigue that they're generating is in a potentially more stimulative position. So that would be my hypothesis. Is either, I probably would go, like, if I actually wrote it down in the paper, I would probably go with, I don't think there'll be a significant difference, but I wouldn't be surprised if the longer muscle length training actually produced better outcomes. But I'd love to see that study done.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I'm very partial, or funny, I'm very partial towards stretched positions, and I strongly believe in at least incorporating some stretched work in a lot of your training. I think the only caveat in terms of my hypothesizing is that I think it also comes with some more, like, damage.
Yeah, it does. That's actually a very good point.
Which will become an increasingly important factor for more advanced individuals. So that's kind of why I don't believe in people really chasing just stretched work, like stretch work. Like, I'm just going to do lots of heavy bottom range RDLs, or something like that.
Yeah. So I think it wouldn't be an unreasonable question to ask, would that increase the occurrence of muscle injury too? I could see that potentially happening. It is a slightly higher risk, if I had to guess. Doesn't mean it's a high risk. It doesn't mean it isn't a reasonable risk that might be worth it. But yeah, like, doing end range of motion training is, it's your end range of motion for a reason, right? So, and yeah, being in that stretch sarcomere position, like, some of the muscle damage that we get is stretch mediated. There are stretch channels which will result in the process, which leads to muscle damage to a greater degree. And how much can the repeated bout effect mitigate that? Will it actually influence your total volume that you can do, or the rate of recovery, or the frequency of training that you can do? I would guess that if you just tried to construct a program of entirely, long muscle length training for every single muscle group, then you would probably be substantially sore and maybe at a higher injury risk. So there probably is some balance here, in my opinion, for sure.
Yeah. Great thoughts. Fun talk today, Eric. And I think people are really going to benefit from this chat, and we're lucky to have Eric on the show. What's new with you in terms of, any new developments, and where can people find you?
Yeah, new stuff here is just that in New Zealand, we are moving on to the endemic COVID phase that probably the rest of the world got to a little earlier. where we are mostly just trying to limit hospitalizations and safeguard against the functionality of our medical system. So that means we're back to the lab, which is great. And I have a bunch of students, both masters and PhD, and even one honor student who were kind of on pause because of COVID. So now we've got a whole bunch of people getting back into the lab. Research is being continued. We got people completing their PhDs, completing their masters. So I'm excited to be putting out more research in the coming years that aren't meta-analyses and surveys. So yeah, that's that. And then of course, like I kind of mentioned, as using myself as an example, I'm in an off-season phase where I'm just focused on trying to put on as much muscle mass as possible, which is fun. I'm enjoying it. There's a whole lot less squat benching and deadlifting, but there's a whole lot more lateral raises and curls and stringers. So it's good times.
Stuff. And for anyone who hasn't, check out Mass, which is monthly applications in strength sport. This is a journal put out every month by Greg Knuckles, Mike Zordos, Eric Trexler, Eric Helms. Oh, wait a second. Eric Helms. It's the guy on the show.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, we have a great monthly research review, and we've done a lot on partials. We've done a lot on recomposition over the years, and surplus and understanding energy balance and all that. So it's a great place if you're interested in subscribing to where we take the most relevant to strength and physique sport studies that were published in the last month, and we review them. We've got a good overview of the studies that come out each month, and we're all people who have done research as well as practitioners and coaches. So it's what we hope is a really relevant take on that research and summary for you. So yeah, and if you don't want to purchase that subscription, if you got bills to pay, that's all good. You can find a lot of free content at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. From there, you can find links to our podcast. You can find links to our blog posts, YouTube, the whole 9 yards.
Great. So yeah, people can check that out in the description. I'm an affiliate for Mass, so you can hit up my link, which will be in the description. And thanks for being on the show, Eric.
Always a pleasure, sir.